good evening or good morning for some of us for sure. My name is ALEKSANDRA GLISZCZYSKA-GRABIAS. I'm the member of the Board of Governors of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and I'm also Professor of Law at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. And I have an enormous pleasure of moderating today's webinar. Earlier today, ADL's latest audit of anti-Semitic incidents of 2024 was released, revealing, and I quote here, appalling high water mark for anti-Semitic incidents in the United States since ADL began measuring. The more than 9,000 assaults, harassment, and vandalism incidents that took place in 2024 are the highest ever traced by ADL. The same applies to most of the European and Western European states, as well as Australia or Canada. IGL engages in everyday legal fight against these new manifestations of anti-Semitism, focusing, among other things, on legal support for the Jewish and Israeli students in Europe. And it is indeed shameful and tragic that in 2025, such assistance is needed, and now more than ever before. We as IGL also engage in important conversations about the growing phenomenon of anti-Semitic hatred, and thus we are today extremely honored to have MICHAL COTLER-WUNSH as our guest speaker, accompanied by our president, MEIR LINZEN. So now for very brief introductions before we start. MICHAL COTLER-WUNSH is Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism and a senior policy strategy advisor. A former member of Knesset, she chaired and served on several key committees there, and she was a co-founder of the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism. Michal's work focuses on anti-Semitism, international law, human rights, and Zionism. She has diverse legal, academic, and professional experience, including roles at the Jewish Federation of North America and Reichman University in Herzliya. Michal serves as a trustee for the Rabbi Sachs Legacy, and she lives in Ra'anana, Israel, with her husband and 4 children. MEIR LINZEN is chairman of the Herzog Fox Niemann, one of Israel's leading law firms, having served as its managing partner for over 20 years. In addition to these roles, MEIR heads the tax department of the firm. MEIR completed his legal studies at Tel Aviv University and received an honorary doctorate from this university in recognition of his contribution to the university and to public life in Israel. MEIR has acted as visiting professor at the Tel Aviv, Bar Ilan, and Ben Gurion universities. He served for approximately 10 years on the executive board of Tel Aviv University and today sits as a member of the board of trustees of this university. MEIR is extremely involved in legal fight against anti-Semitism and counteracting anti-Israeli attitudes around the world. Since 2018, MEIR has served as president of the AGL. He is also the son of Polish Holocaust survivor, and I allow myself to add my very favorite co-Pole. And before I give the floor to MEIR for his introductory remarks for about 10 minutes, and then to Michal for her presentation, which will take around 30-40 minutes, just one technical remark. Please put all your comments or questions into a question and answers box. And after Michal's remarks, I will go to the box and read your comments, present them for panelists for responses. MEIR, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Michal, for honoring us as a keynote speaker. I will try to be short in order that we have enough time to Michal. I'm here as president of the IGL, and I want to take this opportunity to describe our activities. But beforehand, I'm a president of the IGL. Because of my history, and not on the legal field. It was not my choice, but I'm from both my parents son of Holocaust survivor, both from Poland. Both lost most of their families. My mother was in Warsaw Ghetto. She survived Auschwitz, and her last stop in the war was in Bergen-Belsen. So the itinerary, my itinerary this year was in January for the 80 years of liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army, and I'm going on Thursday to Bergen-Belsen for the events commemorating 80 years for the liberation of Bergen-Belsen by the British Army. So that's my, let's say, my emotional connection, why I am dedicated most of my public efforts to fighting anti-Semitism in order that the Holocaust will not happen again. The IGL, International Association of Jewish Lawyers, is a human rights organization. For me, it's very important to mention. We are focusing on combating anti-Semitism and protecting the interest of Israel as a Jewish country all over the world. We are a legal organization. There are many Jewish organizations, but we are a legal organization. There are very few legal organizations. And we are focusing on legal affairs. Primarily, we are active in courts. I have no time to describe exactly what we are doing, but in the last few years, we were involved usually in amicus curiae proceedings in ICC, International Criminal Court, in the ICJ, International Court of Justice, in the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, in the Israeli, US, and Supreme Courts, in the Polish Constitutional Court, and in many, many cases, primarily over Europe. I don't suggest that we make big change in fighting anti-Semitism, but we think that the legal front is of extreme importance. When I was in the 75 years event and in the 80 events of liberation of Auschwitz, and also I had private meetings with Marian Torsky that passed away immediately after the last ceremony. He said that Auschwitz did not fall from heaven. It's accumulation of anti-Semitic history over many hundreds of years and numerous anti-Semitic events. So my take of it that there is difference between anti-Semitic and other xenophobia events because the outcome is the most terrible disaster in the human history, namely the Holocaust. So for myself, I don't see big difference between small anti-Semitic event and big anti-Semitic event. And the reason is that the impact of the number of small anti-Semitic effects are terrible. They created the Holocaust. But even today, we hope that there will not be another big disaster. But the impact in Europe is that almost 60% of the Jews in Europe want to leave Europe because they don't feel safe anymore. They don't feel physically safe, but they also don't feel wanted in their society. And that's a terrible event just 8 years after the end of the Second World War. Therefore, we cannot be tolerant. We cannot connect it to the evils of the state of Israel, there is no justification to any anti-Semitic affair. And another take of it is that I think that with all the troubles of the state of Israel, this is the obligation of our country to lead the fight on anti-Semitism. And as a lawyer, head of the IGL, I think that the Attorney General of Israel has authority under law also to indict in cases of anti-Semitic affairs, and I suggest that the Attorney General, with all the issues that we have here, will consider taking the lead, especially where other countries don't take the responsibility. This is it looks like intervention on other countries' affairs, but we are in emergency situation. And in my nature, although my history, I'm a very optimistic guy. I see the achievement of the Jewish people and the state of Israel after the ashes of the Holocaust, but we cannot close our eyes what's happening, especially since 7th of October 2023. I wish you, if I can say, enjoy the webinar. But I'll say I'm sure it will be interesting, and thank you for the participation. Michal, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Meir. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you to IJL, to Mala, to all those that created this very important opportunity from my perspective to engage with actually what I think is the most important community to engage with, that is the legal community, in this pressing issue as we witness a tsunami of anti-Semitism around the world, Western Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in the aftermath or in response to, if you will, the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust. And the understanding that I'd like to share with you, and because there are lawyers in the room, I'm going to allow myself to maybe delve into a little bit of the importance of understanding how dangerous it is to witness the law be hijacked and weaponized in order to mainstream or normalize anti-Semitism, an ever-mutating lethal hate that has existed for thousands of years. And in this particular case, this strain has actually being enabled by latching onto, I'm going to call it, the guiding social construct of our time, that is the secular religion, if you will, of human rights, the international rules-based order post-Holocaust, post-World War II, created from the ashes of the Holocaust so that never again, in an Orwellian inverted reality in which we actually are witness to again and again, be it in Sudan, be it in other parts of the world in which the international community is silent. So if I may, I would like to be able to share with you my analysis of how we got to the moment in which, no surprise to me, but surprise to many, there was, in fact, this tsunami of anti-Semitism in response to the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust on October the 7th, Simchat Torah, in Israel, and how it is that we can understand that so that we understand what it is that we need to do to identify and combat this ever-mutating lethal hate, as Professor Wister called it, the oldest hatred in the world, effectively, including using the law. I oftentimes begin in the understanding of how we arrived here, actually, not just with a 1948 sort of reconstitution, return of the state of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, to which Jews, a prototypical indigenous people, again, because there are lawyers in the room, I can say that word has meaning. Prototypical indigenous, because indigeneity means that speaks the same language, Hebrew, traverses the same land, Israel, practices the same customs and rituals, hearkens to the same God for thousands of years. That's literally the meaning of indigeneity. That indigenous people return to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution, committed to equality, by the way, of which the Holocaust was just the most immediate or most modern awful event of that exile and persecution, but of which we have to understand the moment in which we address now the critical reclaiming of what the state of Israel is. And actually that mouthful that I said is Israel's vision, mission, values anchored in our Declaration of Independence. The state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, a prototypical indigenous people returned to their ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution, committed to equality. The understanding that from 1948 to 1973, we witnessed a series of wars and operations between wars, openly intent to annihilate the Jewish state, the Jew among the nations, if you will. Conventional wars that failed one after the other. And in 1975 is, for me, the first sort of opening shot of the appropriation and weaponization of the international institutions, its mechanisms, its principles that we refer to as lawyers so often in that international rules-based order, with a 1975 UN Zionism is Racism resolution. Zionism is racism, Soviet propaganda adopted in the UN, actually alive and well on 2025 university campuses, online and on the streets. Zionism is racism is the opening shot of what I would call the unconventional war for hearts and minds that begins to appropriate and hijack those international institutions, mechanisms, agencies, principles in this sort of multi-front war, but begins very carefully. And if you listen, not just to Israel's ambassador at the UN, then Herzog, who rips up the resolution, but actually to Patrick Moynihan, the US ambassador to the UN, who then understands precisely where we've arrived today in this almost prophetic, very, very troubling speech in which he then says, if Nazism is racism and Zionism is racism, then Zionism is Nazism. Welcome to 2025 across every university campus that I've arrived at, every city space that I've come to speak in. Zionism equated with Nazism. And he understood then, 50 years ago, that there is a very, very short mile to go between the appropriation of international institutions, mechanisms, principles, and the moment that we've arrived at 50 years later, 80 years after the liberation of, and a very moving story, actually, MEIR, of your own family story, the understanding of the liberation of the concentration camps that were liberated 80 years ago. That understanding of Zionism as racism is an opening shot in this, I'm going to call it, mutation of anti-Semitism. And you mentioned, yes, I am indeed a trustee in the Rabbi Sachs legacy. And Rabbi Sachs has this understanding that makes accessible what it is about anti-Semitism that, as MEIR said, actually, in many ways, is different than every other kind of hate. I'm going to say it's a very particular kind of lethal hate because it has the ability to mutate. And it mutates by latching on to the guiding social construct of each time: religion, science, and the secular religion of our times, human rights. The understanding this ever-mutating virus develops new strains, new resistant strains to the inoculation we may have created in the past, 80 years ago, let's say, understanding, being able to recognize the mutation that latched onto that guiding social construct of science, or, and by the way, the older strains, as we know in a post-COVID world, the older strains of a virus, they don't die, they don't disappear, but the new strains are the ones that actually enable, if you will, the outburst of the virus once again. And therefore, Zionism is racism as that first opening shot in this unconventional war for public opinion. That leads me actually fast forward to the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism that turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest. And who witnessed the anti-Semitic hate fest that occurred at Durban was actually precisely the human rights organizations, non-governmental organizations that were there on that last day, witnessing, whether it was Human Rights Watch, Bob Bernstein, or others, witnessing their life's work, human rights, and the assurance that that pledge of never again demanded the equal and consistent application of foundational principles. They watched their life's work be appropriated, hijacked, weaponized for the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards, instead of the Jew, Dreyfus, seated on the dock of the accused, using the law, the Jew among the nations, seated on the dock of the accused in the international institutions, in its mechanisms. MEIR mentioned ICC, ICJ. I'll delve into a little bit more of the implication of that and why this is not just a Jewish issue or a Jewish lawyer's issue, but far more an existential moment for all who cherish these foundational principles, mechanisms, and institutions that were mandated and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect this international rules-based order equally and consistently. The 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism actually gave birth, if you will, to blood libel number 2 after Zionism is racism, and that is Israel's an apartheid state. Israel is an apartheid state, and we have to know, and very often Israelis are less familiar with this, Israel apartheid weeks have occurred on every campus across North America, and some places in Europe and Australia and other countries as well. Israel apartheid weeks have occurred since that 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism. So we have Zionism as racism, blood libel number 1. Blood libel number 2, Israel apartheid week. Now for 24 years, there are 24 years worth of university graduates who know that Zionism is racism and who know that Israel is an apartheid state, blood libel number 2. And I'll say in addition to or alongside these Israel apartheid weeks, what actually takes place is the very, very lengthy democratic process to create a holistic definition of anti-Semitism. I haven't mentioned it yet, but it's a critical resource, and it's critically important to understand that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism that enables to identify all strains of what is an ever-mutating virus. That's why it has those 11 examples. By the way, a working definition adopted by more than 40 countries, more than 1,200 entities, including many universities, enables to identify all strains, and as lawyers in the room, we know that every law begins with definitions, because if you can't identify something, you certainly can't combat it. And if you don't define it, you certainly can't identify it. And therefore, that long process in which the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is created by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, not by the State of Israel, not by Jews, but by those who do understand the ever-mutating ability of this lethal hate, that latches on to guiding social constructs of each time, including this pernicious strain of, I'll call it anti-Zionism, or the denial of Israel's very right to exist in any borders. That anti-Zionism turns the Zionist into racist, and that actually then enables the resurgence of all strains of anti-Semitism in those 11 examples, from the Jews killing Jesus, to the Jews controlling the world, to the individual Jew responsible for what it is that the State of Israel demonized, delegitimized, applies double standards to, does, whether that Jew or Zionist happens to be in Sydney, Australia, in Montreal, Canada, or in Amsterdam. The understanding that anti-Zionism has created, or that this new strain of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, actually, and I'm going to pause here for just 1 second just to say, before I continue with the analysis, to say that means that there is a much larger subset of targets, if you will, of this new mutated lethal strain, right? You need not be a Jew to be the target of this lethal hate. So my friend Richie Torres, a congressman in the United States, not a Jew, and certainly not living in Israel, is just as much a target of this lethal strain that I have called anti-Zionism, that denies Israel's very right to exist, because he simply believes in Israel's right to exist. And I'm going to say, in that sort of analysis that takes the 1975 blood libel number 1, Zionism is racism, 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, Israel's an apartheid state, the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law is in the aftermath of the 2023 October 7 massacre, in which the State of Israel, even as it defends itself from openly declared intent to perpetrate genocide, from war crimes and crimes against humanity that happened, I'll say, only on October the 7th, and didn't continue again and again as the Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, stated its intent to commit again and again, a million October 7th, because the State of Israel exists. Even as the State of Israel is defending itself from this openly declared intent, genocidal intent, it is seated in the dock of the accused by none other than South Africa, accused of none other than the term genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was annihilated in Auschwitz, alongside crimes against humanity by Lauterpacht, then the basis for the creation, for the convention, for the punishment, for the prevention and the punishment of the crime of genocide, of which, of course, Israel was one of the first signatories, utilized in the International Court of Justice to seat the Jew among the nations on the dock of the accused in a j'accuse moment, from my perspective, certainly, even as it defends itself from genocidal intent, to accuse the state of Israel of genocide. Of course, backed by then the human rights industry, I will call it, because it's no longer for human rights if Amnesty International, as lawyers in the room, openly in page, I don't remember, 101 perhaps of its 300-page report, actually redefines genocide to remove the need for intent from the crime of genocide, a crime that we should shudder when we utter, that was coined in order to describe the atrocities of the Holocaust, too terrible to imagine, but not too terrible to have happened. And so in this sequence, in a post-2023 massacre, October the 7th, which when I speak to American circles, I say 10/7, like 9/11, was the attack of barbarism on civilization. But that is not the way that it went down. And no less troubling than the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity of October the 7th itself, perpetrated, planned and perpetrated by genocidal terror proxy, but one proxy of an Islamic regime in Iran, that then actually launched this multi-front war with its other proxies and itself as well, Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis from Yemen, and Iran itself to attack the state of Israel. I very often refer to what we're talking about today as actually the 8th war front. As we describe Israel fighting on 7 fronts, the 8th war front was the responses, or became apparent in the responses to the October 7th massacre, the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity. And what do I mean by the responses? The responses of silence. International organizations. I spoke at the UN 1 month after October the 7th. Israel had barely begun to understand what it needs to do in order to respond. But not one women's organization, not one UN women organization or children's organization actually was able to unequivocally condemn the atrocities perpetrated on that day. So we believe you unless you're a Jew was sort of the going statement 1 month after October the 7th and 1 day after October the 7th and 18 months after October the 7th. Responses of silence, as I said, responses of denial. The understanding that we witnessed Holocaust denial, certainly for myself growing up in Canada, systematic Holocaust denial or curriculum Holocaust denial with Zundel and Kijkstra that began or tried to teach Holocaust denial. They were actually prevented from doing so in Canada. In the 80s, when I was in high school, denial of October the 7th began on October the 7th, even as its barbaric perpetrators live streamed the atrocities, the war crimes, and the crimes against humanity, because we are also meeting in a social media era or moment in which we do have to factor in, and I'll delve into that maybe through the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Antisemitism and the work we did there in a moment. But the understanding that denial began on that day was actually of the most disturbing. Certainly for myself, perhaps that sounded the alarms of urgency, though I understood precisely that the tsunami of anti-Semitism might erupt. Denial was not something even I could have fathomed to the extent that it appeared. Responses of justification. Professors who were exhilarated by the atrocities. Judith Butler, whose textbooks I studied in law school, explaining that rape is armed resistance. Justification across spaces and places on the streets of New York City, of Toronto, of Sydney, Australia, and so on, justifying the atrocities perpetrated by a designated, prescribed terror organization, not condemning that terror organization or its supporters, in fact, condemning immediately the Jew among nations that, like any other country, had to protect its civilians and borders, and finally, the attack of Jews and Zionists, private individuals on campus, online, at work, on streets, around the world with, and Alexandra quoted the most recent ADL report, this tsunami of anti-Semitism, hundreds of percentages rise in what is an unleashed, if you will, hate that has been released, the genie from the bottle, with this new strain of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, acting as the new strain that enabled all of the old strains to be legitimized, normalized, mainstreamed, so that there is no longer any differentiation. And if I went on a law school speaking tour before I was in this role to which I was appointed 3 weeks before October the 7th, in order to be able to speak about anti-Semitism and combating anti-Semitism with human rights across law schools in North America, Columbia, NYU, Rutgers, Yale, and others. And in the entrance to NYU Law School, for example, greeting me over the threshold was written in big pink chalk letters, Zionists not welcome, Zionists just coding Jew. Well, you no longer need to code it, so that what you see in an elementary school in Australia or in other places around the world is kill the Jews, and it's become a legitimate sort of mainstreamed, justified, once again, hate that not only targets Jews, as I said before, but targets anybody who stands up to this hate and believes in the right of the state of Israel to exist. I want to, after that sort of analysis, say what it is that I think we have to be most cognizant of, and especially in the context, or we had I say the word context and I think of university presidents now every time I say it, but in the context of the Yom HaShoah sort of moment in which we meet. Look, for many, many years, and when I said this in the Ministry of Justice in Berlin, I think a few people sort of were left not just shocked, but concerned. For many, many years, we focused, as we should, on memory, on remembering what happened in the Holocaust. But that is not enough. Remembering what happened without understanding the mechanism that enabled it to happen, the how it happened, is actually the failure to uphold the pledge of never again. I'll say it again. Never again is a prospective commitment. Never again in the future. We cannot prevent the past. We are commanded to remember the past. The word zachor is the word that appears most in the Jewish Bible, in the Old Testament. Zachor, we are commanded to remember the past. But it's not enough to remember the past. We remember the past in order to be able to identify the threats of the present, in order to be able to prevent the recurrence of atrocities in the future. And therefore, the focus singularly on what happened, without understanding the mechanism of how it happened, and that'll bring me straight to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, is a failure across the board that has enabled the narrative that says, and this is the sentence I said in Berlin at the Justice Ministry, the state of Israel does not exist because the Holocaust occurred. It's precisely the opposite. A Holocaust could not have occurred had the state of Israel existed. The state of Israel is not a 77-year young reparation prize for the murder of 6 million Jews. And the moment that we enable that narrative to be told, and look, we have to look into ourselves as well and ask ourselves, even the concept of understanding of what we tell our own kids when they go to Poland, they go on the March of the Living, they come to Israel. That is not why the state of Israel exists. The state of Israel, as I said at the beginning of our talk, is the nation state of the Jewish people, a prototypical indigenous people, returned after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality. That is the Declaration of Independence, vision, mission, values, if you will, of the state of Israel. The understanding that it is the Holocaust itself that has been appropriated in this Orwellian inverted moment in order to be able to justify this strain of anti-Semitism that unleashed a tsunami of all strains of ever mutating anti-Semitism, all 11 examples, if you will, of the IRA working definition, is actually the most prompting moment from my perspective for not just Jews to understand the dangerous existential moment that we're in, for not just the state of Israel, although I agree with MEIR 100%, and actually in this role, as I said, to which I was appointed 3 weeks before October the 7th, not imagining October the 7th would happen, the goal that I had was actually to create a national strategy for combating anti-Semitism, the responsibility of the state of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, to which hopefully we're getting to now, actually, after the commitment that Israel too signed in global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism that were signed by myself and my contemporaries from around the world, my peers, special envoys from combating anti-Semitism from 35 countries. But the understanding that it's the Holocaust itself that has been appropriated at this and weaponized at this Orwellian moment to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the state of Israel brings me to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, as opposed to all the other definitions that have been offered and including used by, for example, the White House National Strategy for Combating Anti-Semitism that referred to the nexus definition, which actually negates that part of the IRA working definition. Without the mechanism, without the how, without understanding the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards, that is the mechanism that enables not never again, but again and again. And I'll say that enabled the genocide in Rwanda. That didn't happen overnight, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Demonization, delegitimization, and double standards is the dangerous mechanism that enables genocide. We saw it in a post-October 7 reality, not just in the demonization, the delegitimization, and double standards of the state of Israel, but I will share with you that what allowed people to walk past the posters of Kfir Bibas and rip it down was that mechanism so well infiltrated into whether it's university spaces, educational spaces, online spaces, because demonized, delegitimized, and applied double standards to, that was not a human baby whose poster they were ripping down. Demonized, delegitimized, applied double standards to, in my first emergency trip to the United States, walking past the African American Museum, I thought of Emmett Till, and I had this Emmett Till moment just as Israel was about to reveal what it was that happened on October the 7th, including the rape and the sexual crimes that happened on that day. And I had this moment where I thought to myself, if you all remember, Emmett Till's mother makes the decision to bury Emmett in an open casket so that the community will look in and her children will look in and the police will look in to see what it is that murdered Emmett Till. And I had this moment that actually made me sick to my stomach, because if you understand the mechanism of demonization or dehumanization when it's an individual, delegitimization, and double standards, then you understand that as we were contemplating opening up the casket, if you will, and incurring additional trauma to ourselves, to our families, to our loved ones, because we too would see what it was that happened. As we were contemplating that, I realized that it may very well be that people will look in that casket and say, that's just a Jewish woman. She deserved it. Or won't look in at all. Or won't say that they believe you because you are a Jew. And in fact, that is the result that we have seen in a post-October 7 reality. The understanding, when I speak, especially with lawyers, that it is the law. It is its mechanisms and institutions mandated, entrusted to be upheld, promoted, and protected equally and consistently, because every lawyer here knows that selective application of any rule, of any law, of any principle renders the paper it's written on irrelevant, and the rule ceases to be able to protect anyone. The understanding that the reclamation of law has to begin with the law, with its institutions, with I mentioned the ICC, the ICJ, courts of last resort, the implication of their weaponization, including when I was in Knesset, I was the first time liaison to the issue of the ICC. If you think that it's not just our missed opportunity, I mentioned 50 years, but at that point in time in 2020, Fatou Bensouda had already rendered her decision regarding the state of Israel, completely ignoring 7 countries' amicus briefs that actually stated clearly that there's no justiciability, that the issue of complementarity hasn't been met, and so on, with legal principles being completely ignored. If we think for a moment that this is just about the state of Israel, that this is just about Jews and Zionists around the world, and that it is not about the dangerous collapse of the infrastructure post-World War II written in the ash of the Holocaust, so that never again, the collapse of that infrastructure, even as we witness this axis of evil, of which Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis are proxies of just one member, the Islamic Republic of Iran. We can, of course, add Russia and China. And actually, China is a great example because the utilitarian anti-Semitism of China came into play just weeks after October the 7th. I don't know how many of you are familiar with bin Laden's letter to America that was disseminated on TikTok weeks after October the 7th. And you would say, what's the connection? Well, the connection was very clear with Gen Zers actually understanding, all of the sudden understanding, yeah, that bin Laden was right, just as Hamas is right in this war of barbarism on our shared civilization. And so if we sort of encapsulate, and I don't want to take any more of our time, but I do want to end with hope. If we encapsulate the understanding that we have as lawyers, and I shared this conference in Berlin in which I spoke. It began actually at the Lieberman Villa, in which, as you all know, actually the Wannsee conference took place. And though I know factually what it is that happened in creating the final solution, seeing on paper the clarity with which the number of Jews in each and every country is listed by, out of the 15 men in that room around that table, 9 were lawyers. 9. More than half held doctorates. The understanding that it is the hijacking and weaponization of the law that enables the systematic demonization, delegitimization, and double standards, as I called it, that mechanism that's integral to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, as opposed to all the other definitions that have been suggested. And I'll say, in a very presumptuous way, because only the IRA is the result of a long democratic process. Only the IRA working definition is internationally recognized, adopted by more than 40 countries, more than 1,200 entities. That understanding for me, and you can probably hear the urgency in my voice, becomes a personal issue for any one of us who actually understands the danger of enabling the co-opting and weaponization of the law, which then actually can justify, legitimate, and enable the worst atrocities that have occurred over history, especially with the memory of the Shoah in mind, and knowing that anti-Semitism is a very particular kind of hate, as I said, that has existed for as long as Jews have, for thousands of years, that has mutated by latching onto the guiding social construct of each time: religion, science, the secular religion of our time, human rights. And that the hope that I have, because MEIR spoke about the importance of hope, the understanding that if for thousands of years, our people actually had no ability to be able to fight back, had no ability to rise from the dock of the accused. I mean, we know J'accuse and Émile Zola and so on, but the ability and the responsibility, once we have about 45% of us in that nation state to which we returned after thousands of years of exile and persecution in the state of Israel, 45% of us in North America and 10% of us in the rest of the world in relative safety and security, although it's very unpleasant, the responsibility that we have to face this as a people, recognizing that we are the front lines of this raging existential war on our shared humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference, which the late Rabbi Sachs actually made very clear that anti-Semitism is the most reliable sign of a major threat to. That understanding not only sort of gives me this sense of urgency, but also the sense of hope. And I'll say why. You know, hope, I'll quote the late Rabbi Sachs again, differently than optimism, he says, hope is the belief that together we can make something okay. Hope is a very active virtue that takes courage. And I have witnessed, as a mother of 4 of my children as soldiers, all of our friends' kids, all of our kids' friends, I have witnessed a generation, as all of us have, of action and courage. And it is the role and responsibility of our generation to be able to not only witness what they are doing and have done when running, 140% of them rising to the challenge and running towards the fire, if you will, on October the 7th, but actually the responsibility of all of us, each in our worlds, and in this case, in our legal worlds, to act with courage in the way that IJL does, and, you know, in many contexts, each individual, you know, that is here actually participating wherever you may be participating from, whether it's on campuses, on streets, in the workplace. That is the sense of hope that I believe that at this moment in time enables us to actually renew not just the covenant of fate, in which the Shoah was the most immediate example that reminded us of what we are, that prototypical indigenous people, not just a religion, we have a religion, not just a culture, we have a culture, not just a state, now that we have a state, but a prototypical indigenous people, but actually the covenant of destiny not just fate, in which anti-Semitism, if you will, hate from the outside, defines for us or reminds us who we are, a people, but actually the covenant of destiny in which we opt in, we lean in, we choose proactively to not just fight back, but remember who we are, to reclaim our identity, Zionist, integral to the identity of the majority of Jews, not something that we can just shed. Reclaim the foundational principles that have been hijacked and appropriated, reclaim the human rights principles that have been hijacked and appropriated, and in many ways renew that covenant of destiny in order to be able to realize not just our role and responsibility as individuals, as collectives, as communities, but actually as the nation state of the Jewish people. So thank you very much, and I look forward to, if there are any questions, being able to engage in conversation and today and, you know, as time goes on. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Michal. I cannot see any comments or questions, but I think that this is because everyone is so taken. And oh, now one came. I will get to it in a moment. But this was, just allow me to say, spectacular, if this is the word to describe it, and breathtaking, and very touching and emotional also for someone like me coming in a way from the outside world. And I will have a question and a comment concerning this in a moment, but first, let me get to the question. Please repeat the concept in law of defining and appropriating a legal definition of legal violation for another purpose than the law intended.
So it's actually a very important question, because we have to understand, when you equate Zionism with racism, you not only do a great injustice to Zionism, which is actually the progressive national liberation movement of the Jewish people, anchored in the identity of Jews that for thousands of years prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion. You not only do that, what you do is actually collapse what racism is, right? You've redefined racism to minimize, to change, to alter what it is that those who suffer still and suffered in the past, racism. Same with apartheid. Apartheid has a definition. The state of Israel has its challenges, but it is not an apartheid state. I'm old enough to remember precisely what apartheid was. And the moment that you've appropriated that term, and these are just examples, of course, I can enter into colonialism and so many other of the terms that have been appropriated in order to turn the state of Israel, systematically demonize, delegitimize, apply double standards to, into the pariah among the nations, so that the state of the Jews, intended to be an equal state in the family of nations, if you will, turned into the Jew of the states, demonized, delegitimized, applied double standards to. And of course, when I specifically mentioned genocide, the danger of actually redefining what genocide is, even as we speak, when genocides are ongoing in the world that we live in Sudan, for example, that South Africa hosted the leader actually guilty of committing genocide in Sudan weeks before filing that alleged accusation against Israel in the ICJ. When you've collapsed those principles, when you've actually rendered them meaningless or changed their meaning, and the institutions created as courts of last resort, I only touched a point on it briefly, but the ICC and the ICJ were courts of last resort that were actually, with legal terminology, created in order, with limited resources, in order to be able to deal with the worst atrocities committed in places in which there are no legal mechanisms to try those atrocities. Well, if you utilize them in a way that not only quashes their principles of justiciability and complementarity and all of the other principles that they completely overlooked and ignored, but they also have failed to address the real issues in the real places in which these ongoing crimes are happening. And when you think of Amnesty International itself redefining genocide, or Human Rights Watch, actually, when Bob Bernstein, if those of you are not familiar, the founding president of Human Rights Watch, wrote, I believe in the late 80s, an article that published in the New York Times about human rights lost in the Middle East. He predicted, just like Patrick Moynihan predicted in the UN, because they were witness to the appropriation of their life's work of human rights, if you will. So when you take legal terms, you change their meaning, you not just decrease their meaning or invert their meaning in our case, or in anti-Semitism, because that's how anti-Semitism works. It's actually the inversion, the Orwellian inversion. But it doesn't only do this great injustice, or is unable to render justice to those that those mechanisms were created to protect. It actually collapses the entire coal mine, if you will. So as I said at the time in the UN, a month after October the 7th, we may be the bloody canary in the coal mine, but the coal mine will collapse. So if October the 7th is that Kristallnacht moment, 85 years after Kristallnacht, and that 75 years after the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it too is appropriated in that way, that is not just a problem for the Jew among the nations, the State of Israel. That is not just a problem for Jews or supporters of the State of Israel around the world. That is a problem for all of us who cherish these foundational principles created with the pledge of never again, utilizing these legal principles and mechanisms that have meaning, and appropriating and changing them actually collapses the entire infrastructure. I hope that that clarifies it.
Thank you, Michal. I have another question here, and I read it now. The Irish claim that as Israel isn't committing is committing genocide, then the term should be redefined. A comment? Yeah, so that's really a continuation of that Amnesty International redefinition of genocide. And then whether it's, you know, it's actually a really good question, because it reminds me something that I didn't say. What the responses to October the 7th actually revealed in pulling off so many masks is the intersection between, I'll call it the international institutions and human rights industry, between university spaces that have relinquished the responsibility of teaching how to think for the very dangerous prospect of teaching what to think. That is what we see at Harvard, at Yale, and I've said this to university presidents, meaning if that's this moment in time that universities have to reflect on, that is a moment of reckoning. But it intersects with those international institutions and human rights, with what's happening on university campuses, and with the social media spaces. Thank you for reminding me. The understanding that those three, I'll call them echo chambers, actually are not singularly separate. And again, I'll underscore the importance for lawyers to be able to understand that, because we understand actually how to see things breadth across all of those ecosystems, instead of going down rabbit holes. For example, fighting only anti-Semitism online, fighting only anti-Semitism in the international institutions, fighting only anti-Semitism in this university or in all universities. The understanding that if we're going to be able to get ahead of this, we have to stop with what I call whack-a-mole, right? Especially with what happens online, it's very visible. With what happens online, including we want content moderation. I don't want content moderation. With respect, I don't believe that what happens in digital spaces is free speech. It's very expensive speech. It's a very lucrative business model. Somebody is making a lot of money from this polarizing, fragmentizing speech, of which anti-Semitism is just predictive of the danger of. And what we should be demanding is transparency. Transparency of algorithm, transparency of policies, transparency of the implementation of policies. Here too, lawyers understand that when there are, in this case, policies that are not expected of an entire industry that is a money-making industry, it's a business model. And the understanding that free speech has been appropriated in many ways to cover for what is conduct, for what is actually shouting fire needlessly in a crowded theater, for what is your fist punching and hitting my nose, literally on streets, on university campuses, but that what happens online doesn't stay online. It spills over into the streets. In that sense is very, very, for me, very, very critical in understanding, especially for those of us with legal background and legal education, because it means that there are possibilities for holding to account, utilizing existing laws. Forget IRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. When I meet with university presidents or mayors or police chiefs or legislators around the world, it's about implementing existing legislation, whether it's immigration legislation, whether it's policies on university campuses that don't allow the use of megaphones. I'm not even talking about the big stuff. You know, I'm not even talking about the understanding that what we've seen on university campus, that's not speech, that's conduct, right? Vandalism, harassment, bullying, barring other students or faculty from equal access to research, to education. That's conduct, that's not speech.
Forget that. That's, you could say, is a theoretical conversation. I'm talking about the application and implementation of existing rules, laws, policies, equally and consistently. Even when it comes to David, who happens to be a Jew, Sally, who happens to be a Zionist, or Fred, who believes that Israel has a right to exist. And that's an entire, additional conversation that actually delves into what we've seen in the, I'll call it the DEI infrastructure across spaces and places. I think it merits an entire conversation that actually lawyers too need to be having, because a DEI infrastructure created that is not, assuming that it continues to exist, that is not applied to everybody across the board, to including David, Sally, and Fred. That's not a DEI infrastructure that anybody should be espousing to. And if it is applied to everybody, across the board, then we can be talking about how it is, and this is a different conversation I won't delve into now, how it is, and I do think it intersects with understanding of social justice or social injustice that democratic countries have reached, that actually in many ways intersects with what we can offer to the rest of the world, how it is that we've transitioned from equality, equal opportunity, Martin Luther King's dream that his 4 kids will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, to an understanding and the use of the word equity that does not mean the same thing as equal opportunity. It actually means equal results. It's a completely different term, and we can delve into that too, again, as there are lawyers in the room, but I don't want to take up any more time.
I will take as we are running out of time, I will take the privilege of a moderator and ask my question, if I may, because you responded in a way, but I would like to ask about the IRA definition.
Yeah.
I recently joined IRA as a Polish delegate, and what I observe there, and also from what I hear, so in my academic environment, is that there is actually a reverse trend going on of states even trying to pull down from supporting IRA. So my question would be, do we still or should we still push for more states, more institutions, more entities to adopt it despite all these difficulties and controversies, or is it irrelevant? And as you said, we should concentrate fully on demanding that applicable law is being actually applied.
So thank you for the opportunity to clarify. I actually believe that both have to happen. The IRA working definition is the single definition that enables to identify and combat all strains of what is an ever-mutating hate. And the reason that we've seen that pushback, by the way, there was pushback that began long ago, because actually the ability to sever the connection of Jews to Zionism as if it's a political statement succeeded, as anti-Semitism succeeded in the past, to tell Jews that if you just shed that religious pound of flesh, you could be a good human being. And that didn't work out so well. So IRA for me is key. And if we do not fight, and by the way, I've met with universities around the world, university presidents, those that have adopted, they have to implement. Those that haven't adopted are in no way capable to identifying this strain of anti-Semitism that is running rampant on their campus or in their corporation or in their city or by their police officers. The understanding that IRA, I'm going to say again, the result of a long democratic process, the only internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism, and as with any other hate, because I'm a single standard girl, those of us that experience anti-Semitism get to define it. No one gets to tell anti-Black racism, or somebody who experiences anti-Black racism, yeah, that's not racism. Well, neither does anyone get to tell those of us that experience anti-Semitism in all of its strains. That doesn't mean that there are no Jews that say I'm an anti-Zionist. Of course there are. It's the number one question I get from in every meeting that I've had with a second gentleman, with university presidents, with mayors. Oh, I have a Jew who says they're an anti-Zionist. And I say, that's their right. But what's not their right is to preclude me or the students at your campus or the citizens in your city to self-identify as who they are, because Zionist is integral to the identity of the majority of Jews and many non-Jews who believe in Israel's right to exist. And as I don't tell them how to self-define, they don't get to tell me how to self-define. And your responsibility, Mr. President, is actually to ensure that all of us are afforded the same opportunities. And so therefore, thank you for the opportunity to actually clarify. The IRA working definition, I recommend everybody read it. By the way, the number one question I always get is, oh, criticism of the state of Israel. The number one line in IRA is, criticism of the state of Israel, of its policies, of whatever politicians, that's not anti-Semitism. Of course it's not. It's actually how democracies thrive, is criticism. What is anti-Semitism is delegitimization, the denial of Israel's very right to exist. And if October the 7th and the responses to it actually exposed anything in the removal of many, many masks, it is that it's not about where the borders are. It's not about 1967. It's about Israel's very existence. That October the 7th, even with who was attacked on that day, the most committed peace activists in this country who were attacked on that day, the understanding that it is delegitimization, the denial of Israel's right to exist, where no country's right to exist is called into question. Not Cuba, not Iran, not the United States, not France. And that, once again, I'm a single standard girl, is a big old double standard. And therefore, it is the IRA that not only we have to fight for, but ensure that more spaces are committed to. I'll share with you that in the global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism that my counterparts and I passed in Argentina, marking 30 years to the Amia bombing. In those global guidelines, once again, the reference is singularly to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and 37 countries basically recommitted to that IRA working definition. Now we have to hold them to account that they are committed to that IRA working definition, whether they're in university spaces, city spaces, and so on. And one more thing that's very important for me to say. First of all, Israel is the current president of IRA. It's very important for me to bring this into Israel as well. I have met with all of the university presidents, the college presidents. It's a tall order and not so easy. If MEIR is interested in helping me make accessible why the IRA is important, because universities are actually a network, as social media spaces are a network, then I welcome any assistance with that as well. It's not so simple. The only university so far that has adopted the IRA working definition as a statement saying we know to recognize anti-Semitism is actually Ben Gurion University. And the second piece that I want to say after Israel being the president of IRA is, for the year, is, look, not only are we in sort of a reactive battle vis-a-vis IRA and with a huge pushback on it, but in places like, for example, Canada, the Ontario School Board has adopted terms like, for example, I'm going to give an example, APR, anti-Palestinian racism. And as you know now, I'm a definitions girl. The definition of anti-Palestinian racism essentially means that a Zionist is an anti-Palestinian racist. So that is how anti-Palestinian racism is defined in the Ontario School Board. Public schools, students, teachers, principals are now committed to a term. They haven't adopted IRA, but they have adopted APR. So we are not just not one step ahead, we're one step behind, with not just the inability to comprehensively identify and combat anti-Semitism, but a whole new challenge that, brace ourselves, Canada, I mean, though I grew up in Canada, I'll say Israel Apartheid Weeks began in Canada, BDS as a sort of, movement, I'll say, or a campaign across campuses began in Canada. Anti-Palestinian racism is the next big thing to look for that will actually render every individual who self-identifies or is perceived to be a Zionist an anti-Palestinian racist. That's the moment in time that we're at that makes IRA that much more important. And thank you for that question, Alexandra.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm receiving more and more questions, but we are running out of time. But I hope this conversation will continue. And I'm also receiving, enormous praise here for you on WhatsApp. We are humbled and honored by your masterful presentation. But this is just to repeat what I have already said and what was really extremely important and impressive. So I would like to thank you again. And I truly hope that we can develop the collaboration with the AGL and also engage our audience further. But concluding, I would also like to thank wholeheartedly Mala Tabori, our driving force behind this event and many other events at AGL. Mala's idea was brilliant. The choice of the speaker, the invitation was even better and greater, and we are extremely grateful to Mala for her engagement and effort. So with this thank yous, I would like to conclude and close our webinar today and looking forward to further work against anti-Semitism, to engagement of the organizations, but also individuals in the way that you described it, because this is actually the only way to go forward. Otherwise, this tsunami that you described of anti-Semitism would actually have to lead us to the conclusion that this is a never-ending hatred. And not only the longest hatred, as Professor Wistrich said, but never-ending one. But let's try to do whatever we can. Thank you so very much. Thank you, MEIR, for being with us, and also for your personal perspective. And this coming from the perspective of remembrance is also very important, but we have to be cautious and remember that we don't let it be a kind of an excuse and justification for not counteracting current forms of anti-Semitism, as it's often the case by many actors, what we know and what we see all around the world. So thank you once again, and let's be all in touch. Thank you so much.